thing we wrestle with at think tanks, what is our impact? How do you demonstrate impact? How do you demonstrate that an idea that you came up with, that was debated around town, that was part of it may have been implemented, had anything to do with you? It may not have, or it may have. It's really hard to demonstrate that. Think tanks can play an important role in prompting debate and providing a forum to convene a variety of actors. And in particular, think tanks that do not have a particular agenda or focus. So a think tank like RUSI, and there are many other think tanks like RUSI that are politically non-aligned, that do not come to the table with a point of view, but really are focused on evidence-based, data-driven research, and then sharing those findings in the most accessible way possible to try to sometimes influence policy, other times just prompt a debate, sometimes involve public in a discussion about what's going on, like currently with Ukraine, and other times actually, think tanks can play a role behind the scenes, doing quiet conversations with a variety of actors. So there's a number of roles think tanks can play. But I think we need to be careful not to overestimate their value and their worth and what they can do. And I think sometimes people say, well, what impact are you having and what kind of difference are you making? And I think we need to be careful not to assume that we're going to change things in a significant way. We really do exist to provide the time to focus on big issues, to focus in depth on big issues and offer a range of recommendations. If you're working in government, for those of us who have worked in government, you're often really so focused on the day-to-day demands of the job, you don't have time to think about what's going to happen in the next year or two. What are the trends? How can we better prepare for those trends? So think tanks really do offer that service in the best circumstances. For example, with RUSI in the UK, we get funded by a range of actors, public and private, governments and non-governmental actors. We do not get a subvention from the British government. Some think tanks in some countries do get a majority of their funds come from government. Our preference is not to do that because that way we lose our independence. So we say at RUSI we're a friend of government, but we're a critical friend of government. And we're not afraid to speak truth to power. It sounds a cliche, but we're not afraid to do that. And I think my colleagues have done that recently on a number of occasions, whether it's about the British defense strategy or the approach to Ukraine or a number of other issues. And I've had an interesting career because I've basically gone back and forth between governments or the United Nations or the EU and think tanks. And I've always tried in each place to bring my learning from the previous place, but recognizing limitations. So when I worked in the government, I tried to engage with think tanks, tried to understand what researchers are doing, because of course researchers at think tanks, universities and elsewhere often they just speak to different people than people in government do. So you learn many things from think tanks if you're in government, if you're open to it. Not everybody's open to it. And I had colleagues at the State Department who said, well, why bother with think tanks? We have intelligence, we know everything, which of course isn't the case. Likewise, when I was at a think tank, I tried to make recommendations that I thought were practical, that were doable, knowing how difficult it is to make change sometimes in government. And I think having worked in government, having worked for the United Nations, the European Union, and others, you realize how hard it is to change things in a bureaucracy and the ways that you can do it that make sense. And so I always try to make recommendations that I think are practicable, that are implementable. I'm not sure that's even a word, but I try to make practical recommendations that would make sense if you were in government and you say, oh yeah, okay, maybe we need to think about it that way. But recognizing limitations, because sometimes you can work in a think tank and make a recommendation, and then it gets into a government, and then it's so watered down that actually, even if it was a good idea, the way they're implementing it isn't going to work because of all sorts of micro motives, all sorts of turf wars. I mean, I can give you an example if you would like. When I was at CSIS in Washington, right before I joined CSIS, CSIS was involved in a project at the start of the Iraq War about, should government get better at nation building, basically. And they just said, yes, we need a government department and the State Department that can help rebuild other countries, after war. Now, discounting the fact that that's actually a bad idea. It's never a good idea for external people to go in and build other countries, as we've learned more recently. The recommendation was adopted after this panel at CSIS said, okay, they need some sort of body. State Department adopted this. It was called the Office for Stabilization and Reconstruction. And instead of working on Iraq and Afghanistan at the time, they were pushed out of those areas because the people in charge of the State Department didn't want a new office that they didn't think knew what they were doing involved. So they just sort of shoved them to the side, and they ended up working on marginal issues. And it took many years for that office to even get some power again. So here's an idea that came from a think tank that was adopted by government, and then actually it didn't have any teeth once it was inside. So that and once that happens, it's often out of your control if you're at the think tank coming up with the idea. So it's a thing we wrestle with at think tanks. What is our impact? How do you demonstrate impact? How do you demonstrate that an idea that you came up with, that was debated around town, that was part of it may have been implemented, had anything to do with you? It may not have, or it may have. It's really hard to demonstrate that. And we have those conversations all the time with potential funders and with people that we meet with. I think it's really important, if you want to work on research that impacts government, to be able to spend some time. And in fact, even at RUSI, in the United Kingdom, there's less of a practice of going back and forth than in the United States. Typically, people in think tanks go back and forth between think tanks and government. In the UK, it's actually changing, and it's increasing much more. And we've had a number of colleagues, younger and older, who've had secondments for a year or two, and then they come back. Sometimes they don't come back. But I think it's very important, because you do need that practical experience. I mean, then you're not going to run around and say, we need to end poverty. You're going to be quite practical about your recommendations, that you're going to maybe bite off a small piece of it and try to make those changes. And likewise, when you are in government, I was in the Obama administration for almost 6 years. And I was, a technical expert, but I was still sort of a political appointee. And I remember people telling me when I started, if you want to get something done, don't try to do too much. Focus on just one or two things, and then work really hard on getting those things done. So if you come into government and say, I'm going to, solve the Israeli-Palestinian dispute, you're never going to achieve that. If you go in and you say, I want to work on protecting civilians in conflict, in peacekeeping missions, and I'm going to work on it in this way, you have a much better chance of making a difference. You're on the think tank side, you have to make sure your work is backed up and that you're transparent about what you do and where your sources come from. So we are very transparent about our funding, who funds our work. We're very careful when we get a funder, because of course we have to raise money for everything we do, that funder knows that they can't change the conclusions of our research, that they may not like what we come up with, and then sometimes that's the last time someone funds you. So I think there's a duty on the think tank side to make sure that they are transparent, that they're following the rules, that they remain independent, if they're an independent think tank. Not all of them are. And then I'd say on the government side, it's being open to being challenged. You don't need to do what someone's recommending, but certainly be open to it. And to engage in conversations. I think our best experiences are when we go back and forth with governments. We say, this is what we're doing. We'll share, the results halfway through and get your feedback and incorporate some and have a kind of an iterative conversation with government officials. And I think in countries like the UK, smaller countries versus the United States, there is more opportunity to engage with government officials. I mean, I've been very impressed in the UK how often and at how many levels that we are able to engage with government actors, whether they're desk officers or, the chief of the defense staff. We have a lot more opportunity to engage than I ever did in the United States when I worked at CSIS, and also even including MPs and others. So, and they're open to it, and they like having that opportunity often to speak, because of course it gives them a chance to publish a speech or to test some of their ideas. Different people come at it from different, ways in government. Some of them are sincere about engaging and some of them aren't, but, you don't always know. But I think generally we have very strong relationships with government, but I think we work very hard to make sure that we're, as I said earlier, a critical friend. We're not going to promote everything they do. There are some think tanks that are aligned to political parties, and then they play a different role than independent ones do, like us.